Welcome to another Mailbag session. And usually this week I'm recording this Mailbag session actually before I do the rant. And there is a reason for that, and you'll see that when you see the rant for this week. Anyhow, these are questions and comments that you guys leave on the channel that I think are worthy of either a further discussion or I try to give an answer to. First one from Nicholas Arnios, and he writes, hi, what do you think is good? I buy a Roland Jupiter 80 and a Jupiter XN and I use both. Is it a good idea? Thank you. And funny enough, this is the discussion that I have been thinking about for a long time actually, because I obviously, as you know, if you've watched the channel, I own a Jupiter 80. I love my Jupiter 80. It was one of the best buys I've made, definitely. It is a superb synthesizer. So it's a thing I've been thinking about. So let's go back to Nicholas's question. So this is in response to good Jupiter XM demos, which I did sort of back in November 2019. So Nicholas, what you've said is basically, what you've not said is how you're going to use it. And that's kind of sort of quite important when you're sort of building your setup. If it's going to be studio use like I use, I very rarely take my synthesizers out on the road, then certain synthesizers don't make sense and certain synthesizers do make sense, if that makes any sense whatsoever. So I think the first thing is you need to I don't understand what your setup is. So what is it? What is your setup? I finally got over to the toy shop in Guildford, Anderton's, plug Anderton's, to have a look at the Jupiter XM. And how do I feel about it? For me, I can tell you now, the Jupiter XM is not an option for me. I think personally the XM is not a live machine. I think the XM is more of a studio machine than a live machine. And the reason for that is you're moving from a scenario like this where you've got full-size keys, and the Jupiter 80 has full-size keys, to the XM that has these sort of three-quarter size keys. And what I found just sitting in the shop and playing around with it the other day is that my fingers very easily went from the note I thought I was hitting to the note next door, or I was hitting two notes at the same time. And I dare say if I had it all the time I'd get used to it, but I think if you're playing in a live environment and you're playing one keyboard above the other or one keyboard like that, then if you're playing keyboards that have smaller keys on one of these, the note memory or the key memory that sits up here that tells the hands where they need to locate themselves on the various keyboards will not be able to adjust, and therefore if you're playing something with full-size keys and three-quarter size keys or half-size keys, then you're going to struggle to actually play the right notes. That's my feeling, and I just found that from playing around with it. Whether I would get used to it or not over time, I don't know, but I'm so used to playing keyboards with full-size keys. In fact, I think I have very little in my studio that isn't a full-size key. And I do notice when I move from a full-size key to a lesser size key, I struggle sometimes with sort of hitting the right notes. So that's the first thing. In terms of the combination being good or bad, what I would say is the Jupiter 80 and the X, not the XM, but the X will complement each other. Much the same as the Jupiter 80 and the System 8 will complement each other. And the reason I say that is the X will give you stock legacy sounds. So if you are going for sounds from the Jupiter 8 or the Juno or the whatever other stock sounds they give you on the X, they will be readily available to you on that machine. You won't have to program them up. Whereas the 80 will give you stock pianos. I mean, the 80 has a beautiful piano on it. It's not Berlin Grand style piano, but it is a really workable piano. Fabulous wide strings. which you can layer over each other. So you can layer over and you can slightly detune. You get wonderful string harmonics on the 80, as well as wonderful pads. In fact, actually, the pads on the 80 are just out of this world. They really are. So you've got a massive programming capability on the 80. You have program capability on the X, but it's not to the same degree because you're limited in terms of the sound generation. But the combination of the two would probably give you everything you ever need for playing a set live. The limitations will probably be driven by what the keyboard is capable of, and therefore you probably at that point, if you're into that sort of market, you are probably looking at taking a Kronos or a Phantom or a Montage or something like that out as the master keyboard if you're looking for that massive amount of sound for a keyboard to generate, because the 80 and the X will generate a lot of sound, but if you're looking for massive expansive sounds, then they're probably not powerful enough. You probably need to move to a computer based system like the ones I've just said. So hopefully that answers that question. The next one comes from Yokeda, which is actually Ross. And he writes, any thoughts on similar models in the Soundcraft range? If you also had a look at these, was there anything that swayed you towards the Mackie instead of the Soundcraft? And there was. This is in response to Addressing the Sound, which is this sort of a rant I did middle of December 2019. And I've got to be honest and say, when I was looking for a mixer, when I made the decision that I really need to go for a mixer, and the Mackie is just off to one side here, it's actually here, so I can actually play with the volumes while I'm recording this sort of stuff. And when I was looking at that, the end choice came down to sort of pretty much between three mixers in that sort of £200 to £300 price bracket. So on the face of it, all three mixers would do exactly what I wanted them to do. Okay, so I went with a set criteria, and all three mixers sort of hit that base criteria. What I didn't write down on my criteria was the USB interface. Okay, so that was something that wasn't on my base criteria. It wasn't because I didn't want it, it was because I just forgot to put it on the piece of paper. So when I was sort of going through this thing, they sort of met the base criteria. And the three mixers that sort of came into that area were the Soundcraft EFX12, which will appear up here somewhere, the Behringer X2222 USB, that has USB, there's a bit of a giveaway there, isn't it? And the one I bought, which was the Mackie Pro FX12. So my basic criteria was I wanted at least 10 channels, and ideally I wanted stereo channels as well. So that was one of the key criteria. I wanted faders, not knobs, in terms of bringing sound in and out, because I'm so used to faders that was what I wanted. I wanted a very limited amount of EQ on the channel, so I can actually just sort of boost the bass or tip the treble or whatever it happened to be, depending on what I was doing. But I wanted something that faithfully reproduced, which is what all three mixes would do. I wanted line inputs and I wanted mic inputs. All three channels do both of those. And I wanted to be able to take balanced outs to either an amplifier or something else. If it was a chain of mixers, then balanced out to another mixer. So that's kind of the sort of base criteria I had. It wasn't massive base criteria, I have to be honest. I mean, it was sort of something that gave me a working environment I could go off and start thinking about what I wanted. So, of the three mixers, the Soundcraft is probably the oldest. And to be honest, I think it needs a revamp, as its circuitry does not currently have USBs and preamps. So that kind of knocked it out for me when I started thinking about USB connectivity and what I was going to connect this thing into, whether it was going to be a DAW or it was going to be something else. So that was one of the things. The other thing about USB connectivity is I wanted something that was class compliant. And what class compliant means is you don't have to download drivers onto the target device. The target device effectively can recognise the mixer based on it gives its credentials to the device, and anything it needs to run is provided at the same time. That's what class compliant stuff means. If you haven't got a class compliant device, you end up having to download drivers. So that's pretty much what that means. So as I said, it doesn't have the Soundcraft doesn't have USB, it doesn't have preamp capability. On the plus side, it is designed for being moved around, so it comes with rack mount pieces, so you can actually rack it into a standard 19-inch rack, all well and good. And again, all the connections are on the front panel, which was something I was looking for. So I really wanted the connections on the front, not down the back. And if you're racking something, having connections down the back is not the most brilliant idea in the world, because you can't get to the damn things. It also has a PFL facility, which neither of the other two actually have. So if you're doing some sort of connecting mixers up, you probably need to go and buy your own generator to do that to match the mixers up. But having said that, the Soundcraft mixer was a good mixer. However, there are better. So the next one I moved on to was the Behringer, which was the X treble 4 USB. And in actual fact, the Behringer mixers went sort of kind of from an 8-channel to a 16-channel mixer. There was nothing really in between. So this is the 16-channel version. It has USB, it has preamps. It would integrate into my current recording setup really easily, which I was sort of kind of pleased about. It had all the other stuff. The downside for the Behringer was the preamps I didn't think were as nice as the ones on the Mackie. And the other thing about the Behringer is that a lot of the connections are actually on the back of the mixer, not on the front of the mixer. And for me, I really wanted, as I said, I wanted the connections on the top of the mixer, not round the back. So if I did decide to rack it up at some point in the future, then I wasn't having to sort of muck around having connections or trying to get around the back of the mixer to change connection points. So that was the Behringer, and then we went for the Mackie, the Pro FX12, which is the one I bought, which I think is the newest mixer on the market out of these three. As I said to you, I like the preamp structure. The preamp structure is really quite nice. Seems to work really well with my recording setup. Now I've got it in. Same USB functionality as the Behringer, so there wasn't very little in terms of what the Behringer offer from a USB to what the Mackie would offer from a USB perspective. It's only a 12-channel mixer as opposed to the 16, and that I sort of kind of thought that might be an issue, but having sat back and thought about it before I bought the Mackie, it's not an issue at all, because it's very unlikely that I am actually going to have 12 channels of source in where I've bought this mixer for. So I knew what I was going to use this mixer for, and I'm going to use this mixer pretty much for this sort of stuff, and for getting the synthesizer audio into these videos. So I kind of thought that's where it was going to go, or where it's going to go to a separate sound recorder. It doesn't matter. But the scenario was that I was going to take this and use it for mixing the instruments into the videos as I was doing videos, because I was struggling with that with the old setup. So that was my predominant amount of use. So was 12/16 an issue? For me, no. I was really looking for something around about the 10-channel area. So 12 channels, of which 4 of those, well, I say 4 of those, 12 channels, of which 8 of those channels are dedicated stereo channels, actually works really well for me. So when it came down to it, when I was looking at these three mixers, the Soundcraft was out because it was old, needs a refresh. That went out, and then it came down to the USB, the Behringer, and the Mackie. The Behringer is cheaper, right? Okay, so there is a cost point differential there. It is cheaper, and it's cheaper by quite a few pounds. I think it was cheaper by about £60 if I remember correctly. So I could have bought the Behringer. I could have got a lot more channels. But the quality of the Mackie mixer, when I saw them and held them, was better than the Behringer, in my opinion. So I went for the Mackie, and I suffered the price point, but it does give me everything I wanted, and that was pretty predominantly why that unit came in, as opposed to the Soundcraft, which, Ross, you asked about. So hopefully that answers that one. Next one from my friend Gary Robinson. So, plug. He's part of the Death Beats. Go look at their channel. Very interesting that the prices for mixing consoles have come down so much. I had no idea. Back in the 90s, when I was still making tunes without a DAW, I struggled with Mackie 8-track as all I could afford. I'm pretty sure that it cost me £500 from Anderton's. Well, Anderton's is a shop you need to go to. They are very knowledgeable on this sort of stuff. Well, most of them are very knowledgeable on this sort of stuff. I don't want to, but they are very good setup. Very, very good setup. Whether you use their internet web shop, which is actually extremely good, or you use go into the shop. And I highly recommend, if you are in Surrey and you can get to the shop, go into the shop. It is a Aladdin's cave, especially the drum check. Good for taking your frustrations out on something with skin on it. So I'm pretty sure it cost me £500 from Anderton's back in 1997. For years now I've wanted to put together a DAW-free setup and will definitely go for a Mackie mixer again, but realistically I'm going to need 2 Roland MX1 units as hubs for my AIRA and boutique stuff. I think it could work if the MX ones are connected to each other to the Mackie via audio outputs and then connected to each other via MIDI. And again, this was in response to the same video addressing the sound, talking about the Mackie Pro FX12 coming on stream. So, some might say a mixer is a mixer. I would completely disagree with them. But, however, the way these things are put together now, you get a fairly decent mixer for not a lot of dosh. That's pretty much sort of where we're going. I mean, I can remember back in the day using a 2482 with a Fostex 8-track recording system, and that was a relatively simple mixer, to be honest. I mean, it wasn't a high-end mixer at all. It was relatively simple. We had 24 tracks purely because of doing things like miking up drums and what have you. Used it quite a lot in live work, that particular mixer. And I can remember that it set the owner back. I didn't own the mixer, but because I didn't have that sort of cash in the day. But I can remember it set him back the better part of £3,000 for the mixer at the time. And then say this is literally an analog mixer, 2482. And those who don't know what 2482 means, you've got 24 channels, then you've got 8 channels, then you have 2 channels. That's kind of how the mixer board is set up, and it's sort of kind of designed for sort of things like having an 8-track feeding back onto the console. Anyway, that's how it was designed. Now, nowadays you don't tend to get things like 28.2 style mixers because everything's gone digital and you can basically route the signals wherever you like. But back in the day, that's kind of how the mixing technology worked, and you had different buses with different things on it. But I'm not going to go into mixer technology because somebody on here will tell me I'm wrong, so I'm going to shut up. I know what I know, and I'm going to leave it at that. Anyway, what I was getting at is now you can buy a really, really decent, and I mean decent, 48-channel full digital mixer plus remote inputs with full connection into your DAW, and you can get the whole lot for under 3,000 quid. That's how technology has moved on. You know, where we are now and where we were is completely different. I mean, I have been looking at the Behringer X32 as a mixer for the studio potentially, and now I'm probably not going to buy the X32 anymore. I think I'm going to buy the Behringer Wing. And people will say, well, why are you going Behringer? Because I think you get a hell of a lot of bang for your buck in those mixers. And looking at the X32 usage, people have been using the X32 for a number of years now. Nobody has anything bad to say about the damn thing. So, you know, let me see what happens to the Wing when it comes in and starts. I mean, the Wing is more designed for sort of studio work. You just have to look at it. So let's have a look at how that all fares when it comes in. But if it doesn't get any bad write-up, maybe that is the next mixer to go into the studio when I expand the studio. We shall see. I would Basically, Gary, what I would really be interested in seeing is what you eventually end up with. I can see how you would probably run the two MX ones into. I mean, if you had something like a Mackie, you could run them stereo into channels 5 and 6 and 6 and 7 and 8, and you still have the mono channels there for mics and other stuff, and you've also got two further stereo channels sitting there for other bits and bobs, and you effectively are using the MX ones as submixers in that scenario. The only thing I would say to watch out for is you probably, if you don't already have one, I'd suggest you go and get a 1 kilohertz noise generator, or tone generator, whatever they call them nowadays, because you're going to have a very sort of interesting balancing setup to try and get all these mixers actually talking to each other within the right ranges, so you're not clipping everywhere. Anyway, let me know how you do it. I would be really interested. The other thing I like about the Play It Live setups is the whole sort of scenario about Play It Live setups. You know, you're not recording everything to backing tracks and what have you. And one of the best people I've seen in recent years who does a Play It Live setup is the Finnish artist Kibu. If you watch his videos, he tends to use, I think it's an MPC, an older MPC as well, as a hardware sequencer. And he takes that on the road with him, and he plays, effectively he's playing everything live, and the backing tracks are just coming up off this MPC to keep everything in time and sync. Very, very clever guy. I've got a lot of time for Kibu, and when he made it to the UK, and I couldn't get tickets this time round, but I will be getting tickets next time round. So next time you're in the UK, Kibu, I will be coming to see you. And the last one for this section, from Corrine H, and this one actually is quite an old question, and again it's all to do with the fact that YouTube have recently changed the interface for people like me, so I can see stuff I haven't actually responded to. So I'm slowly getting round to sort of looking at these questions and responding to them. So this is a very old question, and I suspect you've solved the problem by now, but I thought it was worth going over the issue so other people could find out or could try and solve the same problem. And it says, can you give a tip about the brand of solder and soldering iron? And this is in response to the Korg T1 refurbishment video I did way back in September 2017. In fact, the Korg T1 refurbishment videos have had lots and lots of hits on them. So there's obviously lots of people out there with Korg T1s that want to carry on playing. And too right too. Up the T1, because this thing is superb. I love this machine. That's why it keeps turning up in my lounge. Anyway, so firstly, the first thing is, in terms of solder in iron, or soldering iron, you don't need an expensive one. Okay, that's the first rule. There's, if you're not a professional, you don't need to go and buy professional products. Yes, professional products look cool and funky and whatever else, but if you're not a professional, don't bother wasting your money, because you get away with a fairly decent, cheap soldering iron. Now, what I would say is, what you really want is, if you're doing repair work on your keyboard, you want something that probably heats up quite quickly, holds the temperature, and allows you to change the tip. Okay, that's sort of kind of the three things. Depending on what sort of work you're doing. So if you're doing very delicate and fine one, you want probably a very delicate fine tip. If you're doing sort of broad brush stuff, you can have quite a wide tip on them. If you can afford it, go for a solder station. What does a solder station look like? Well, this is a solder station. So this is mine. Okay, this is what I use. So that's my soldering iron. As you can see there, the tip's in there, and the tip comes off, and the tip goes back on, like that. Okay, so that's my soldering iron. And so you can vary it. So you can change this in various formats. There's the actual tip. Right. But that's the one I use, and that does not plug directly into the mains. That plugs via this connector into this, which is effectively like a transformer. And what this allows me to do is, this sits on the desktop somewhere else, which means that you've actually got very little weight in the soldering iron itself. which is good if you're holding it for a long periods of time, or you're trying to get into tight spaces. And what this allows you to do, I know it says on the front of it digital soldering iron station, but that's just marketing, to be honest. But what it allows you to do effectively is allows you to set up on here 3 temperature zones, okay, depending on what solder you're using, and you can instantly just press one of those temperature zones and the thing will recycle itself down to the temperature. That thing there will then cool down or heat up to the temperature that you've set on here. And that's pretty much how it works, but you can then manually dial in temperatures. So I've pretty much got this set into lead solder, one of the settings on here, which I can't remember what the melting frequencies are. I know when I looked it up and did it, that was what I did. Lead-free solder, I think is number 2, and I can't remember what the third one's set up for. But that's what I use. Relatively inexpensive. This cost me less than £100. So wasn't expensive at all. Has a nice good on-off switch at the side. There you go. Okay, so you can just switch this off on the unit without having to go to the plug, because normal soldering irons don't have an on-off switch. They just stay on as long as they're plugged in. Whereas with this, I can switch it off and I can switch it on very, very quickly. That's why I liked it. And that's why I use it. So you don't need a particularly expensive soldering iron, but a good one. Okay, so that's the important thing. In terms of solder, solder comes in sort of kind of 2 main flavors, lead-free and leaded. Now, leaded is legacy, so a lot of the old machinery that we probably have in terms of the keyboards themselves will probably be soldered with leaded solder. Okay, that is just what happened in the day. Now, since then, there's been a movement within various industries to remove lead from products. We used to use lead everywhere. And the reason we used lead was because lead melted at a relatively low temperature. It was very pliable when it was in a solid format. So when you had a lump of lead, you could actually make it and ply with it and what have you. That's why they used it for things like lead flashings, because you could put a piece of lead into the wall and you could bash it with a hammer and you could mould it into the shape of the wall and you got a very good seal. So that's leaded and unleaded. Now, most keyboards, most legacy keyboards you're going to be working on will probably have lead solder on them. Okay, that's where they were at that point in time. So when you open a keyboard up and you start soldering stuff, my advice to you is do it in a well ventilated area. And in actual fact, if you could have a fan just blowing across the top of you somewhere, just to blow it out of a window or something, even better, because that means you're not breathing in lead fumes. However, when you come to put the things back, you're going to be using lead-free solder, or you should be using lead-free solder. There are going to be reasons why you would not use lead-free solder. And this is just a bulk standard solder. It is an SN 93.3% alloy, which is what it says on the side there. Can you see that? There you go. That is bulk standard. That's the kind of stuff I use. As I said, I don't do a huge amount of soldering, so that keeps me going for a very, very long period of time. In fact, I think I did the whole of the T1 on that as well, and a number of other keyboards, and I'm still got loads of this stuff left. You don't have to apply lots of solder when you're soldering. Okay, the only piece of advice I'd make, apart from well ventilated area, is that if you are taking a component off the board that has had leaded solder on it, make sure you do a very good job of cleaning the old solder off. So either using braid or using a solder sucker or whatever mechanism you're going to use, get that solder off the board, or as much of it off the board as you can, because funny enough, these two things don't like each other too well. So the more you can have of lead free as opposed to leaded on that contact means that you will make a very good contact rather than the two compounds trying to sort of argue with each other. It will work, it does work, but my advice is, if you're moving from one to the other, clean as much of the other off before you can do it. And the other piece of advice I'd use is, if you can get hold of it, get hold of electrical engineers flux, I think that's what it's called, which is sort of a bottle, a small bottle like that. And if you're doing a lot of soldering in an area, quite often it's a very good idea just to sort of run a brush of this stuff over the entire area. It makes this stuff flow better and you get a better joint. But you don't need to use that, because in the middle of this is a compound that actually is flux that allows this to flow well. The other flux is for doing things like if you're putting the chip on a board, it's quite easy to do what they call a run. So you flux it all up, you get a very hot soldering iron, you get solder, and you just literally just run it straight across the top, and it creates a very quick joint. It's a technique that was taught to me years ago. But you really need lots of flux on the board to do that, and then you clean the flux off with isopropyl alcohol. So that's the other thing you probably need when you're doing this sort of work, is a good bottle of isopropyl alcohol. The higher the alcohol content, the better. Something in the 99s is really good. And then once you've done your soldering, you can effectively use a cotton swab and you can go over the whole area with isopropyl alcohol and clear off any crap. There you go. So hopefully that answers your question, Karina. And by the way, Karina, how are you getting on with your recording? I'd love to see some more stuff. If you liked the content of the video you've just seen, please give it a thumbs up. It just helps the YouTube algorithm with its selection process. If you want to leave a comment, please feel free to do that as well. Down below somewhere should be the ability to do that. I do try to respond to all the comments that are raised on the channel. Sometimes it takes me a few weeks because of what I'm doing, and I'm getting more and more and more comments and questions raised on the channel, so it just takes sometimes a little bit of time to do a bit of research. If you want to be notified when I put more rants, mailbags and videos about this sort of legacy tech and even modern tech on the channel, hit the subscribe button, hit that bell icon, and you'll be notified by YouTube when stuff happens. I try to publish at least 2 times a week, sometimes more, sometimes less. Until next time, bye bye.